Officer Michael Rodriguez's routine patrol through a quiet, low-income neighborhood takes a sudden and horrifying turn when a 911 call leads him to a decaying house on Sycamore Street. What begins as a standard call for help turns into a nightmare as Michael and his partner, Robin, discover a scene of unimaginable neglect. Inside the abandoned home, they uncover signs of recent child activity and a growing sense of dread. As they force their way in, they stumble upon an unimaginable horror, a young boy, locked away and chained in a room. Michael's world shatters as he realizes the boy is his son, Nate, whom he hasn't seen in 2 years due to a painful divorce. What follows is a journey filled with guilt, rage, and the desperate desire to make things right. As Michael fights for justice and to heal the wounds of the past, he is determined to rebuild his life with his son, no matter the obstacles ahead. Officer Michael Rodriguez and his patrol. The midday heat was unbearable, the sun beating down mercilessly on the worn streets of Oakwood. Officer Michael Rodriguez squinted through the patrol car's windshield as he drove slowly, taking in the run-down neighborhood around him. The streets were lined with crumbling buildings, their paint peeling away in long strips, revealing the rot beneath. Overgrown yards were scattered with discarded furniture, rusted appliances, and piles of trash, signs of years of neglect and decay. Michael glanced over at his partner, Officer Robin Thomas, who was sipping from her water bottle, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was a slow day, almost too quiet. Robin was the first to speak, breaking the silence. "Pretty quiet today," she said, her voice light, as if attempting to break the monotony. Michael nodded, his gaze still scanning the surroundings. The quiet had a strange feel to it, a stillness that made him uneasy. The sort of calm before a storm. "Yeah," he muttered, "almost too quiet. Makes me wonder what's brewing under the surface." It wasn't like Oakwood had ever been a bustling, vibrant neighborhood. Once, decades ago, it had been a thriving community. But the years had not been kind. The area was now an uninviting wasteland of poverty and desolation. The buildings looked like they were on the verge of collapsing, abandoned cars stood as ghostly remnants of a past life, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. Michael had patrolled this area enough times to know its story, to recognize the signs of hardship etched into every corner. Yet, the silence today was different. It felt like something was waiting to happen, something hidden beneath the surface of this broken place. His thoughts were interrupted by the crackling of the police radio. The dispatcher's voice, sharp and urgent, cut through the air. "All units in the vicinity of Oakwood, we have a 911 call that needs immediate investigation." A young boy's voice, very faint, said only, "Send help," before the line went dead. "We have an approximate location based on cell tower pings. Address is 1542 Sycamore Street." Michael's fingers instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter, his heart skipping a beat at the mention of a child's voice. It wasn't often that calls like this came through. He exchanged a quick glance with Robin, both of them instantly on edge. The combination of a child's distress and the immediate need for action set off alarms in both their minds. "That's just a few blocks from here," Robin said, her voice low but steady. She was already pulling up the location on the car's GPS. Michael could see the concern in her eyes, and it mirrored his own. 104, Michael responded into the radio, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "This is Unit 247. We're en route to 1542 Sycamore now. ETA, 3 minutes. He flipped on the sirens, and the sound echoed off the buildings, adding a sense of urgency to their drive. The patrol car surged forward, weaving through sparse traffic as the officers made their way toward the address. The sirens were almost deafening, a stark contrast to the silence that had hung over the neighborhood just moments ago. As they neared the location, the neighborhood seemed to grow increasingly decrepit. The roads were littered with abandoned cars, their once shiny frames now covered in layers of rust. The yards, when they weren't overrun by weeds, were home to discarded furniture, broken appliances, and piles of garbage, all left behind by a community that had seemingly forgotten the meaning of upkeep. Michael's eyes flicked over the street signs, his mind already on high alert. "Something's not right here," he muttered, more to himself than to Robin. His instincts as a police officer had been honed over years of experience, and something in the air told him that this wasn't just another routine call. His hand hovered near his weapon as they turned the corner onto Sycamore Street, the crumbling houses on either side casting long shadows in the afternoon light. Robin glanced around, scanning the area just as carefully. "I've got a bad feeling about this one," she murmured, her hand resting on the holstered weapon at her side. She had been on enough calls to recognize when things weren't adding up, when the tension in the air told you that danger might be lurking just around the corner. Michael didn't need to respond verbally. He knew she shared his apprehension. "Stay alert," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Could be squatters. Could be worse. We don't know what we're walking into." As they approached the address, Michael's stomach churned in anticipation. He had been on countless calls in his career, but there was something about this one that felt different. The area was more desolate than he remembered, the houses even more abandoned. The oppressive heat seemed to hang in the air, and the weight of it pressed down on him, making everything feel heavier, more suffocating. The patrol car skidded to a stop in front of 1542 Sycamore. The house before them was a perfect picture of decay. The exterior was a mess of peeling paint, exposing the rotting wood beneath. Several windows were boarded up, and the ones that weren't were either cracked or had missing panes. The porch sagged dangerously, its steps warped and broken, a safety hazard at best. The yard was a jungle of overgrown grass and weeds, tangled with trash and debris. An old refrigerator lay on its side near the curb, its door hanging open like the gaping mouth of some forgotten beast. "Jesus," Robin muttered under her breath as she stepped out of the car. Her voice was laced with disbelief as she took in the scene before them. "This place looks abandoned." Michael nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the property for any signs of life, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds, just an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as they approached the front door cautiously, their hands hovering near their weapons. "Stay sharp," Michael warned quietly, his instincts telling him that this might be more than just a simple case of a forgotten house. He reached for the doorbell, but there was no response. With a glance at Robin, he knocked firmly on the peeling wood of the door. "Police," he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet. "Is anyone home? We received a call for help at this address." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael strained his ears, listening for any sound coming from within the house. His heart raced, but there was no answer. Robin tried again, her voice louder this time, a sense of urgency creeping into her tone. "This is the police. If anyone's inside, please come to the door." Still, nothing. The silence felt thick, almost suffocating. Michael exchanged a look with Robin, their unease growing with every passing second. "Let's try the door," Michael suggested, his voice low and filled with tension. He reached for the knob, but it wouldn't turn. The door was locked. "Locked," he reported, his gaze flicking to Robin's face. They exchanged a worried look, the weight of the situation starting to settle heavily on both of them. This wasn't just a run-of-the-mill disturbance. Something felt terribly wrong. "Dispatch," Michael said into his radio, his voice steady but edged with concern. "This is Unit 247 at 1542 Sycamore. No response at the door. Requesting permission to enter the premises." There was a brief pause before the dispatcher's voice crackled back through the radio. 247, permiss granted. Use caution." With Robin covering him, Michael positioned himself in front of the door, his hand on his holstered weapon, ready for whatever might lie beyond it. He gave the door a solid push, but it didn't budge. It was too solid. "Let's check around back," Michael suggested, his voice low but commanding. He motioned for Robin to follow as they moved cautiously around the side of the house, their boots crunching through the dry grass. The backyard was just as neglected as the front. The weeds had grown tall and unkempt, and more piles of junk littered the ground. As they made their way through the mess, Michael's foot caught on something partially hidden in the tall grass. He stumbled but caught himself just in time. Robin reached out to steady him, concern in her eyes. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Michael nodded, then bent down to see what he had tripped over. His breath caught in his throat as he pushed aside the weeds. There, half buried in the grass, lay a small rusted tricycle. Nearby, other toys were scattered across the yard, an old dump truck, a faded baseball, a stuffed animal, their condition making it clear they had been there for some time. "Robin," Michael said quietly, his voice filled with a sense of dread. He gestured toward the abandoned playthings. "Recent activity." Robin's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the scene. "These haven't been out here that long," she remarked. Her voice was tight, a clear indication that the sight of the toys unsettled her as much as it did Michael. Despite the heat of the afternoon, a chill ran down Michael's spine. "Something's very wrong here," he muttered under his breath. The urgent call and arrival at the scene. As Michael and Robin stood in the backyard, the weight of their discovery was beginning to settle over them. The toys, the dilapidated state of the house, and the eerie silence pointed to something far worse than just an abandoned property. They had hoped for the best, but with every minute that passed, their fears were growing. Michael couldn't shake the image of the empty, broken house and the possible fate of the child who had made that haunting 911 call. The feeling that something terrible had already happened gnawed at him, and he pushed the unease aside, trying to focus on the task at hand. The last thing they needed was to let their emotions cloud their judgment. As Robin looked around, searching for any other signs of life, Michael reached for his radio, calling back to dispatch. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247, he spoke into the radio, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "We've found evidence of recent child activity, but there's no response from inside. We're requesting backup for forced entry." There was a pause before the dispatcher's voice crackled back over the radio. "Copy that, Unit 247, the dispatcher replied. "Backup en route. ETA 5 minutes. Michael felt a brief moment of relief wash over him. Backup meant more resources, more eyes on the situation. He and Robin wouldn't have to face whatever awaited them inside the house alone. He kept his eyes on the door, which still stood between them and whatever lay hidden in the shadows of the building. 5 minutes, Robin said, her voice grim, as she glanced at the growing crowd of curious onlookers who had started to gather. A few people had emerged from their homes, stepping cautiously out onto their porches. Michael noticed their wary expressions and the way they kept their distance. It wasn't uncommon for law enforcement to face hostility in these neighborhoods, and he had learned the hard way to expect resistance from residents who were distrustful of the police. "I don't like the looks of this," Michael muttered, keeping his voice low so the gathering crowd wouldn't hear. The last thing he wanted was for this situation to escalate into something even more dangerous. In neighborhoods like this, tensions ran high, and any misstep could result in trouble. As much as he wished for a smooth resolution, he knew the reality of the situation was far more complex. Robin nodded in agreement. "We need to be prepared for anything," she said. Her hand lingered near her holstered gun, a subtle but important reminder that they were entering a situation that could turn hostile at any moment. The minutes dragged on in silence as they waited for backup. The air felt thick and oppressive, the hot sun casting long, unforgiving shadows across the street. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. Michael couldn't help but feel the heaviness of the moment, the unsettling knowledge that they were walking into a situation with no clear answers. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence, signaling the arrival of backup. Michael's body instinctively tensed as he heard the rumble of patrol cars rolling up the street. He glanced toward the sound and saw 2 more units pulling up to the scene. Officers in uniform climbed out of the vehicles, their expressions serious and focused as they joined Michael and Robin on the lawn. "What's the situation?" asked Officer Jensen, a veteran cop Michael had worked with before. Jensen's eyes scanned the house, taking in the surroundings with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen it all. Michael quickly briefed him on what they had found so far: the locked house, the toys in the yard, and the faint signs of recent activity inside. He didn't have all the answers, but the evidence was enough to make it clear that something was very wrong. "I need to get in there, ASAP," Michael said, his voice urgent. The knowledge that a child might be in danger weighed heavily on him, and he couldn't afford to waste another second. Jensen nodded grimly, the line of concern etched deeply into his face. "All right, let's do this by the book," he said, his voice firm with authority. "Hernandez, Garcia, you 2 cover the back. Robin, you're with me on entry. Michael, you take point once we're in." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he prepared himself for what was coming next. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when everything would either fall apart or start to make sense. He knew that whatever they found inside that house would change everything, and he couldn't afford to think about the consequences. His son's safety, and the safety of any other children involved, had to come first. "Let's move," Jensen ordered, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. With military precision, The officers moved into position. Michael's pulse quickened as he stood by the door, ready to act. He glanced over at Robin, who gave him a quick nod of reassurance. She knew the stakes as well as he did, and neither of them were about to let anything stand in their way. The neighborhood had fallen eerily quiet again. The only sounds were the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Michael's mind raced with possibilities as he took position, his hand still hovering near his weapon. They could be walking into a situation with dangerous individuals, or they could be facing something far worse. The uncertainty hung over him like a thick fog. "On three," Jensen called out, his voice steady but filled with determination. 1, 2, 3. With a powerful kick, Jensen's boot connected with the door. The old wood splintered, and the lock tore free from its frame. The door flew open with a resounding crash, and a foul stench poured out from the house, a mixture of urine, feces, and decay. It was so overwhelming that Michael had to fight the instinct to gag. The smell spoke of years of neglect, of lives that had been left to rot in the shadows. It was the smell of suffering. Michael forced himself to breathe through his mouth as he stepped into the darkened interior, his flashlight beam cutting through the murk. The scene before him was almost too much to process. The house was in a state of squalor, every surface coated in grime, the air thick with the stench of decay. Moldy food containers and old takeout boxes were strewn across the counters and floors. A thick layer of grease coated everything, giving the room a slimy sheen. The refrigerator door hung open, and Michael didn't even want to think about what might be inside. "Clear," he called out, his voice muffled as he held his arm over his nose and mouth to block out the stench. The interior of the house was beyond what he had expected, far more horrifying than he had imagined. This wasn't just a neglected home, it was a place where someone had lived in filth and despair for far too long. From the living room, Michael heard Robin's voice. "Clear here too, but you need to see this," she said, her tone grim. Michael made his way carefully through the debris-strewn hallway to join her. The living room was just as filthy as the kitchen. Torn, stained furniture was scattered around a TV that looked like it hadn't worked in years. Empty liquor bottles lay scattered across every surface, evidence of long nights filled with drugs and alcohol. But it was the sight of the drug paraphernalia on the coffee table that caught Michael's attention. The table was littered with syringes, scorched spoons, and small plastic baggies containing residue of white powder. It was clear now that the house was not just a place of neglect, it was a place of addiction, where drug use had consumed the lives of those living here. "This looks like a heavy meth habit," Robin remarked, her voice grim. Michael nodded, his jaw clenched tight. This was not just a case of a neglected child, this was something far darker. The drugs, the squalor, and the sense of abandonment all pointed to the kind of home a child should never be forced to live in. But they had to keep going. They had to find the child, if he was still alive. "We need to check upstairs," Michael said, his voice thick with determination. "Be careful. The floor doesn't look stable." They made their way up the creaking stairs, their flashlights sweeping the dark rooms one by one. As they cleared each room, the evidence of drug use was impossible to miss: broken glass, burnt spoons, and empty baggies scattered across the floor. Yet there was still no sign of the child. Finally, after thoroughly searching the entire second floor, Michael and Robin regrouped at the top of the stairs, confusion and frustration mounting. "Nothing," Robin said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Are we sure this is the right house?" Michael frowned, equally puzzled and concerned. "Maybe. But let's do one more sweep downstairs, just to be sure." As they began to head back down the stairs, a faint sound froze them in their tracks. It was a child's voice, weak and frightened, calling out from above. Michael's heart skipped a beat. "I'm here," the voice whispered. "Please help." The desperation in those words sent chills down Michael's spine. He knew that voice. It was the same voice he had heard in the 911 call. And it was coming from somewhere upstairs. Discovering the horrors within. The faint, desperate voice that echoed through the dark house sent a jolt of fear through Michael's body. He and Robin exchanged a glance, their eyes wide with a mix of dread and determination. The realization hit them both like a wave. The child they had been searching for, the one whose faint cry for help had sparked this entire investigation, was still alive. And whatever situation he was in, it was far worse than either of them had imagined. Michael didn't hesitate. His heart was pounding in his chest as he turned back toward the stairs. Every instinct told him to move faster, to get upstairs as quickly as possible, but the noise of the creaking floorboards underfoot reminded him that caution was still paramount. They couldn't afford to rush in blind. He and Robin raced back up the stairs, their weapons drawn and their eyes scanning every shadow. Every corner, every crevice could be hiding something or someone. But as they neared the top, the sound of the child's voice grew clearer, more urgent. It was faint, but there was no mistaking the fear in it. "Where are you?" Michael called out, his voice echoing through the hallway. His breath was ragged, as much from the tension as from the rush of adrenaline. "We're the police. We're coming to help." For a moment, there was silence. Then, just as Michael was about to call out again, the voice returned, weaker than before but still there, still pleading for help. "I'm here. Please, help." Michael's breath hitched in his chest, and without thinking, he bolted down the hallway toward the far end, where he believed the voice had come from. The light from his flashlight flickered across the dim walls, casting long, eerie shadows as he moved swiftly but cautiously. He could feel Robin right behind him, moving just as quickly, ready for anything. As they reached the farthest room at the end of the hallway, Michael stopped short. The door was closed, but unlike the others they had checked, this one wasn't locked. There was no sound from inside, but the air seemed to vibrate with an eerie tension. He reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling slightly. This could be it. This could be the moment when they found the child, the one who had made the call that had led them here. He knew that every second mattered, that whatever they found inside could change the course of the investigation. But the thought of what they might find, what kind of horror might be behind that door, weighed heavily on him. "On three," he whispered to Robin, his voice barely audible. Robin nodded, her hand still on her weapon, ready for anything. 1, 2, 3. With a forceful push, Michael opened the door, and what he saw inside made his stomach drop. The room was dark, with only a single beam of light from the hallway cutting through the gloom. It was sparsely furnished, nothing but a dusty old bed, a table, and a rusted radiator on the far wall. The air was heavy with the smell of neglect, a stifling mixture of dampness and decay. And there, in the corner of the room, chained to the radiator, was a small child. Michael's heart stopped as his flashlight beam landed on the child's emaciated form. His legs went weak beneath him, but he forced himself to stay upright. He couldn't allow himself to lose control now. Not when the child needed him most. The boy was hunched in the corner, barely moving. His small body was covered in bruises and sores, his skin pale and gaunt from obvious neglect. His eyes, sunken and hollow, struggled to focus on Michael, but there was a faint glimmer of recognition in them. Despite the overwhelming sense of horror that gripped Michael's chest, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. This was his son, Nate. His little boy. "Oh God," Michael choked, his voice breaking as he stepped forward, his hands shaking as he reached out to the boy. "Nate, it's me, Dad. I'm here. I'm here now." The words felt hollow as they left his mouth, and his breath caught in his throat. This was not the son he had known 2 years ago. The boy in front of him was nothing like the healthy, happy child he remembered. Nate was a shell of himself, his body a map of abuse and suffering. Nate's eyes flickered with what little strength he had left. His cracked lips parted, and with obvious effort, he whispered, "Dad. I'm Nate. Do you remember me?" Michael felt the world tilt beneath him. His knees threatened to give way as he stared at the skeletal child in front of him, his son, the boy he had not seen in over 2 years. The weight of guilt and anger crashed down on him like a tidal wave. How had it come to this? How had he failed to protect his own son? His chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he knelt beside Nate, his hands trembling as he tried to assess the extent of the boy's injuries. "Of course I remember you, buddy," Michael managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. He fought to keep the tears at bay, to keep his emotions in check. This wasn't the time for that. Right now, he needed to focus. He needed to get Nate out of here. "I'm here now. We're going to get you out of here, I promise." He reached for the chain that bound Nate to the radiator, his hands shaking as he tried to free his son. The heavy metal had rubbed Nate's skin raw, leaving angry red marks around his neck and ankles. Michael could barely contain his fury as he realized how much pain and suffering his son had endured, alone and terrified. "Robin," Michael called out, his voice thick with emotion. "I need help. We need to get him out of here now." Robin's voice came back to him almost immediately. "I'm on it, Michael. Just stay with him." Michael knelt beside Nate, his eyes scanning the room for anything that might provide more clues. There was nothing. No sign of the boy's captors, no indication of how long he had been locked away in this room. The only thing that mattered now was getting Nate out of here and getting him help. Nate's voice, weak and barely audible, interrupted Michael's thoughts. "Water, please, Dad. I'm so thirsty." Michael's heart broke as he glanced around the room. There, on the floor next to the radiator, was a nearly empty plastic bottle. He reached for it quickly, his hands still shaking with the urgency of the situation. Carefully, he lifted the bottle to Nate's lips, helping him take small sips. "Easy, buddy," Michael murmured softly, his voice filled with both pain and relief. "Help is on the way. You're safe now." But as Michael looked at his son, his once lively, energetic little boy, now reduced to a malnourished and broken child, he couldn't shake the overwhelming guilt that surged through him. How had this happened? Why hadn't he fought harder for custody after the divorce? Why hadn't he done more to keep Nate safe? The flood of questions, the guilt, and the anger threatened to overwhelm him, but Michael pushed them aside. Now wasn't the time for self-pity or regret. Now, all that mattered was getting Nate the help he needed. Everything else could wait. As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, Michael fought to contain the rage that was threatening to explode inside him. He would find the people responsible for this. He would make sure they paid for what they had done to his son. The aftermath and reflection. As Michael cradled Nate in his arms, his son's frail, weakened body pressing against his chest, the chaotic sounds of sirens in the distance seemed like a distant echo. The paramedics had arrived, and immediately began assessing Nate's condition. But for Michael, every moment felt like an eternity. The world around him seemed to blur as his focus remained solely on his son. Nate was alive. But the sight of him, the boy who had once been full of life, his laughter ringing through the house, was nothing more than a shadow of the child he remembered. "His vitals are weak," one of the paramedics muttered as they hooked Nate up to an IV drip, stabilizing him as best as they could. "We need to get him to the hospital. Fast." Michael could barely focus on the paramedic's words. His mind was spinning, thoughts racing faster than he could process them. His eyes remained fixed on Nate, watching as the boy's weak, sunken eyes fluttered open, only to close again as the exhaustion of his ordeal overwhelmed him. The child was barely conscious, his once vibrant spirit seemingly drained by the horrific abuse he had endured. As the paramedics worked, Michael had a million thoughts rushing through his mind. How had he not known? How had he let this happen? His gaze fell on the battered old flip phone that had been found next to Nate, the one that had likely been his son's only connection to the outside world during his captivity. He clenched his fists tightly, a mixture of rage and guilt coursing through him. Nate had been a prisoner in that house, his home, locked away and left to suffer in silence. Michael had missed so much. He had been distant for too long, caught up in the bitterness of the divorce, focusing on his own pain and anger, rather than ensuring his son was safe. And now, here they were. Nate had found a way to reach out for help, a desperate plea for salvation when he was at his weakest. The reality of the situation hit Michael like a punch to the gut. For years, he had convinced himself that things were fine. He had been granted limited visitation rights, and after his ex-wife's DUI, he had hoped that the worst was behind them. But he had allowed his own frustrations to cloud his judgment. He had believed that the situation was improving, that Nate would be okay. But now, he could see just how wrong he had been. Nate's weak voice brought Michael back to the present. "Dad," Nate whispered, his words barely audible. Michael leaned in close, fighting to hold back tears. "I'm here, buddy," he whispered, stroking Nate's tangled hair gently. "I'm not going anywhere." Nate opened his eyes, his gaze unfocused but still recognizing Michael's face. His voice, though faint, held a sense of trust and relief. "I thought you forgot about me," Nate whispered, his lips trembling with emotion. "I thought you didn't care." Michael's heart broke at the words, and his guilt deepened. How could Nate have thought that? How could he have believed that his own father didn't care for him? "I'm so sorry, Nate," Michael choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been there." I should have done more. But I'm here now. I'm never leaving you again." Nate's small hand reached out weakly, grasping Michael's fingers as if to reassure himself that his father was real, that he wasn't dreaming. "I knew you'd come," Nate mumbled, his voice cracking. "I knew you would." Tears filled Michael's eyes as he held his son's fragile hand. Nate was a fighter. After everything he had been through, starvation, abuse, neglect, he had still managed to hold on long enough to reach out for help. The strength and resilience in his son's voice left Michael in awe. As the paramedics finished preparing Nate for transport to the hospital, Michael stayed close by, never once letting go of his son's hand. He had so many questions, so many things he needed answers to, but all of that could wait. For now, his focus was on Nate's survival and making sure that the boy was safe, getting the care he needed to recover from the horrors he had endured. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a heavy thud, and Michael climbed into the back, staying by Nate's side. The ride to the hospital was a blur, sirens wailing, the flashing lights illuminating the night. But in that moment, Michael's thoughts were consumed by the future. His mind replayed the image of his son's bruised, emaciated body, chained to the radiator. It was a sight that would haunt him forever. But it also gave him a new sense of purpose. He couldn't change the past, but he could make sure that Nate had a future filled with love, safety, and the chance to heal. As the ambulance tore through the streets, Michael's thoughts shifted to the investigation. The police were already starting to piece together the details. They had found Sarah, his ex-wife, and her boyfriend, who were now in custody. Michael's gut twisted with a combination of anger and disgust as he thought about what had happened in that house, what his son had been forced to endure. Sarah. His mind flashed back to their time together, to the bitter divorce that had torn their family apart. He had always known that she had her demons, alcohol, drugs, and a pattern of destructive behavior, but he had never imagined it would come to this. How could she have let her son suffer like this? How could she have allowed her addiction to destroy the life of their child? The bitterness of the past threatened to swallow him whole, but he pushed it aside. The focus now needed to be on Nate and his recovery. Justice could wait. The most important thing was making sure that Nate survived and that he knew he was loved, that he had a father who would never abandon him again. When they arrived at the hospital, Michael barely registered the bustling activity around him. The paramedics rushed Nate into the emergency room, the medical staff springing into action as they assessed his condition. Michael followed close behind, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. One of the nurses caught his attention, pulling him aside briefly. "Mr. Rodriguez, your son is in critical condition. He's severely dehydrated, malnourished, and has multiple infections. We're moving him to the pediatric ICU now. He's stable for now, but he's going to need extensive care." Michael nodded, barely hearing the nurse's words. His head felt like it was swimming, but his mind was laser-focused on Nate. The details of the medical report didn't matter right now. What mattered was that his son had survived, that he was alive, and that Michael would be there every step of the way as he fought for his son's recovery. The nurse led Michael to the waiting area, and he slumped into a chair, his body finally succumbing to the exhaustion he had been pushing aside for hours. But as he sat there, staring at the closed ER doors, a deep sense of relief washed over him. Nate was safe. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Michael allowed himself to believe that everything was going to be okay. He would be there for his son. He would fight for him. And together, they would rebuild their lives, one day at a time. Justice and healing. Michael sat in the hospital waiting area, his mind buzzing with thoughts and emotions as he replayed everything that had happened. The silence in the room felt suffocating, the sterile walls of the hospital only amplifying the chaos inside his head. Nate was in the pediatric ICU, where doctors were doing everything they could to stabilize him. Michael had been informed that his son had a long road ahead. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, and multiple infections were only the beginning. He would need extensive care and rehabilitation to recover from what had been done to him. But the anger, guilt, and confusion still gnawed at Michael. He couldn't shake the image of his son, chained to that radiator, his body a shell of what it once had been. The questions were endless. How had this happened? Why hadn't he known? Why hadn't he fought harder for custody? As much as he wanted to be by Nate's side, to hold his hand and reassure him that everything would be okay, he knew there were things that needed to be done. He needed to make sure that whoever had done this to his son would never hurt anyone again. The people responsible had to be held accountable. Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his dark thoughts. It was a text message from Officer Jensen, the officer who had helped find Sarah and her boyfriend. Michael quickly opened the message, his eyes scanning the words. "We got them. 2 arrests at the house. Woman claims to be Nate's mother. Call me when you can." The words hit Michael like a ton of bricks. He felt a rush of emotion, relief, anger, disgust. He had known, deep down, that Sarah had been involved. She had always been a troubled soul, struggling with addiction, but Michael had never imagined it would come to this. To this kind of destruction. She had allowed her own son to be tortured. And for what? For drugs. For a man who was equally as broken and twisted as she was? Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His hands were shaking, his mind racing. He needed to talk to Jensen, to find out more. But more than that, he needed to see Sarah. He needed to understand how it had all gone so terribly wrong. He made his way out of the waiting room, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the sterile hallways. The weight of the decision to leave Nate's side, even for just a moment, felt unbearable. But Michael had always been both a father and a cop. And sometimes, the two roles collided in ways that were difficult to navigate. He had to see justice done for Nate. He owed it to him. Jensen was waiting for him when he arrived at the precinct, her expression tight with controlled frustration. Michael could see the same anger in her eyes, the kind of anger that came from working the streets for years, seeing the worst humanity had to offer, and knowing that people like Sarah and her boyfriend had slipped through the cracks. Jensen had been there when they arrested Sarah, and now Michael needed answers. "I need to see them," Michael said, his voice low but firm. He wasn't sure whether he was asking for permission or making a demand, but it didn't matter. He couldn't just sit around and wait. He needed to face them, to hear it from their mouths. How they could treat a child like that, their own flesh and blood, in such an inhumane way. Jensen gave him a look of concern but didn't argue. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice softer now, filled with the concern of a fellow officer. "You don't have to do this. It's not going to bring him back, Michael. And you're too close to this case. Your emotions are clouding your judgment." Michael swallowed hard, his jaw clenched. "I need to see them. I need to understand why. Why they did this. Why she let this happen to Nate." Jensen sighed deeply, her shoulders sagging with the weight of understanding. "All right, let's go. But I'm coming with you." They walked down the dimly lit corridor of the holding cells, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly. The sound of their footsteps was the only noise in the otherwise quiet building. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of dread and anticipation building as they approached the cell where Sarah was being held. When they reached the holding area, Michael's breath caught in his throat. Sarah was sitting on the narrow bunk in her cell, her knees drawn up to her chest. Her once beautiful face was gaunt, sunken from the years of substance abuse. Her skin was blotched and pale, her eyes dull and lifeless. She looked almost unrecognizable to Michael. The woman he had once married, the mother of his child, was nothing more than a shell of the person he had known. Beside her sat a man Michael had never seen before, a thin, scruffy man with a patchy beard and greasy hair. His eyes locked onto Michael's with a look of defiance, as if daring him to say something. Michael's gaze quickly moved to Sarah, his ex-wife, and he felt a rush of emotions, anger, betrayal, sadness, but mostly a deep, consuming sorrow for what she had done to their son. The man in the cell sneered at Michael as he stood up. "Well, if it isn't the hero cop," he said with a mocking tone. "Come to gloat, huh?" Michael's fists clenched at his sides, the rage bubbling just beneath the surface. He stepped closer to the bars, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "Why?" he demanded, his voice hoarse. "How could you do this to a child? To your own son?" The man shrugged casually, as if the question were trivial. "It was the kid's fault," he said dismissively. "He was always whining, always in the way. He disturbed me and Sarah. We had to shut him up somehow." The words felt like a punch to Michael's gut. His vision blurred for a moment, his body trembling with anger and disgust. The sheer indifference in the man's voice, the lack of any remorse, any humanity, shocked him to his core. How could someone be so cruel? How could anyone treat a child like that? The man continued, oblivious to the pain his words were causing. "It wasn't that hard. I chained him up, kept him quiet. He was just a burden anyway. But hey, maybe now that you're here, you can take him off our hands. It'll be a lot quieter without him around." Michael's hands were shaking with rage, and he had to fight to keep himself under control. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely more than a growl. "How long did you keep him locked in that room?" The man laughed bitterly. "Who knows? Maybe a couple of weeks. Doesn't matter." Michael could barely hold himself back. The urge to reach through the bars, to strangle the man, was almost overwhelming. But he held it in, just barely. The need for justice, for answers, was all-consuming, but Michael knew that violence would not help. Not now. Not in front of his son's tormentors. The conversation shifted as the man began to explain how everything had started. His story was twisted, the narrative a strange mix of half-truths and lies that painted Sarah in a darker light. Michael listened intently, trying to make sense of the mess that had become his life. "Sarah was a wreck," the man continued, his tone more self-satisfied now. "She had a problem. She was alone, you know. Her cop husband was a drunk. She couldn't handle the kid. I came into the picture, and things got easier. She started doing meth, and everything changed. She didn't want to be a mother anymore. She just wanted to get high." The words hit Michael like a blow to the chest. The lies, the manipulation, everything that had gone wrong in their lives now made a sickening kind of sense. Michael had tried to hold his family together, but it hadn't been enough. He had failed. And now, his son had paid the price. The investigation into what had happened to Nate continued, but for Michael, the most important journey had already begun. The last few weeks had been a blur of hospital visits, police interviews, and court hearings. Every day brought new challenges, but also new victories. Small steps forward in Nate's recovery, in Michael's own healing, and in the pursuit of justice for the horrors his son had endured. Nate was no longer confined to a hospital bed. His body was healing, though the emotional scars would take much longer to fade. Michael spent every moment he could by his side, reassuring him that he was safe now. But the road ahead was not easy. Nate was still recovering from his physical injuries. His bruises were fading, and the malnutrition and dehydration that had once left him weak were slowly being addressed through a carefully planned regimen of nutrition and care. The trauma from the past, however, would take longer to mend. The nightmares, the feelings of abandonment, and the overwhelming fear that still haunted his every waking moment were just the beginning of the emotional healing process. But Michael was determined to give Nate the love, stability, and protection he had been denied for so long. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There were still court hearings to attend, custody battles to face, and therapy sessions for both of them. But for the first time in years, Michael felt a sense of clarity. The bitterness and regret that had clouded his thoughts had been replaced by a deep, unwavering sense of responsibility. The legal process was slow, but Sarah and her boyfriend were eventually convicted of the crimes they had committed against Nate. Michael wasn't sure what kind of justice could truly make up for what had happened, but he was grateful that the system had, at least, held them accountable. Sarah was sentenced to time in a rehabilitation center to address her addiction, but Michael knew that her recovery would never undo the damage she had done. The emotional wounds she had inflicted on Nate would take years to heal, and Michael had no illusions about what that journey would entail. He thought often about his mistakes, the missed opportunities to fight for custody, the times he had let his own anger and resentment toward Sarah cloud his judgment. He had always tried to tell himself that the situation was out of his hands, that there was nothing more he could have done. But now, with the clarity that only the truth could provide, Michael realized how wrong he had been. He had been absent when Nate needed him the most, and it had cost his son dearly. Now, the work of rebuilding their lives began. Michael had taken a leave of absence from the police force, at least for the time being. He wanted to be there for Nate as he adjusted to life after the trauma. He knew that he couldn't change the past, but he could work to make the future better. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but Michael was committed to facing them with the same determination and resolve that had guided him through every difficult moment of his life. Nate's progress was slow but steady. Each day brought new victories, small moments of joy, of laughter, of light breaking through the darkness that had surrounded him for so long. Michael marveled at the strength Nate had shown, at the courage that lay beneath the scars. For all the cruelty that had been forced upon him, Nate had survived. He had found a way to hold on, to fight, to reach out for help. And that strength would continue to carry him forward. Michael had arranged for therapy, both for Nate and himself. The healing process was complex, and Michael understood that it wouldn't be easy. They would both need time to process everything that had happened, to work through the trauma they had experienced, and to rebuild their relationship. But every night, when Michael sat by Nate's bed, his hand resting gently on his son's, he knew that they would get through this. Together. One evening, as Michael was helping Nate with his homework, a task that had once seemed so trivial but now felt like an important step toward normalcy, Nate looked up at his father, his eyes still tired but filled with a flicker of hope. "Dad," Nate asked quietly, his voice hesitant but sincere, "do you think I'll ever be okay?" Michael's heart swelled as he looked at his son, his face still so young but marked by the experiences he had endured. It was a question that Michael had asked himself countless times over the past few weeks. Would Nate ever truly be okay? Would he ever be able to overcome the scars, both physical and emotional, that had been inflicted upon him? But as he looked into his son's eyes, Michael knew that the answer didn't matter as much as the promise he had made to Nate. He had promised that he would be there. And he would be. No matter what. "You will be," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's going to take time, but you'll be okay. We're going to get through this. Together." Nate's lips curled into a small, tired smile. "Together," he repeated softly. And for the first time in a long while, Michael allowed himself to believe it. They would rebuild their lives, piece by piece. The road would be long, but as long as they had each other, they would find a way forward. As Michael sat there, his son leaning against him, the weight of everything that had happened slowly began to lift. The memories of the pain, the anger, and the guilt would always be there, but they no longer defined who he was. He was a father. And he was ready to be the father that Nate deserved. He would never make the same mistakes again. The world outside the window seemed to stand still, a new day dawning as the first rays of sunlight broke through the horizon. And in that moment, Michael knew that no matter how hard the journey ahead would be, he was ready to face it. For Nate. For their family. For their future. Together, they would rebuild. And nothing could ever break the bond they shared.